Community is unity, as we heard this morning, and it's very nice to be here. Bonjour à tous, bienvenue. Thank you, merci, for being part of, actually, I should start, I'm going to rewind. I have the pleasure of inaugurating the first panel of the first ever Canadian Genomics Summit with the first ever fire drill. Hey. Just a reminder, there are simultaneous translating devices, doohickeys as they call them. They're at the back at the AV, and so if people want to use them, they should use them because there might be some switching between, French and English as we go forward. Mon nom est Elisabeth Douville, je suis présidente du Conseil de Génome Canada. Et je suis aussi présidente directrice générale d'IRICOR. IRICOR is a not-for-profit organization that's dedicated to accelerating the discovery, development, and commercialization of novel, highly innovative therapies for oncology and rare diseases. IRICOR is about supporting innovative ideas to fuel growth, which is really what this panel, the next panel, the first panel, is about. Likewise, Genome Canada's sector wouldn't be where it is today if it weren't for innovative ideas and if we didn't find ways to capitalize on those ideas. The commercialization of cutting-edge genomics technologies is already transforming healthcare, food systems, and environmental sustainability efforts across Canada. As Rob said in his opening remarks this morning, we're just getting started and there's so much more that can be done. When we think about it, Génome Canada a que 25 ans. Nous sommes des jeunes adultes. On a plein d'énergie. On a fait toutes nos erreurs d'adolescence, ne pas dire les conneries d'adolescence, but the best is yet to come. We haven't even hit our prime yet. So imagine what we'll look like by the time that we're 40 or that we're 60 as an organization. So that's pretty amazing to think about. This morning's announcement, awesome, as I like to say, Rob. I mean, I don't know if you guys noticed, Rob finishes all his emails by awesome, and everything is awesome, but it is awesome, actually. Genome Canada, the enterprise, is awesome. So the announcement this morning was awesome. The Fireside Chat was actually also awesome as well, and thank you to Nasser and Pam for being here to make this announcement. 175 million. I think we should applaud. And I don't want to say, but a little bit in the nick of time, really, isn't it? So, so the announcement about the Canadian Genomics strategy is obviously amazing news for our community, and it's really going to help us, start accelerating and driving genomics growth within the Canadian ecosystem. So we know, actually, that innovation holds the key to ensuring Canada's prosperity. It drives productivity, it creates jobs, it makes our nation more competitive. But coming up with the innovative ideas and the processes or products, unfortunately, is not enough. We need to be able to commercialize them or to have them adopted into our system, and Canada has a long-standing commercialization challenge. Despite boasting some of the world's best universities and researchers, which are in this room today, Canada has actually lagged behind its peers when it comes to realizing the economic and societal gains of our homegrown innovation. We can do better in translating the world-class research happening in this country into practical applications that will bring real economic benefits. We can do better in turning ideas into real-world products and services in a way that boosts Canada's productivity. We can do better at commercializing the brilliant ideas of Canadian researchers ourselves and exporting less of that research elsewhere, not to say south of the border, and potentially ending up importing those results back as part of intellectual property. It doesn't make sense. En français, on peut faire mieux, on doit faire mieux, et on va faire mieux. C'est pas suffisant d'avoir des bonnes idées puis de développer des produits. Il faut pouvoir les faire adopter et les commercialiser, et il y a un énorme défi, on le sait. Et c'est là où est-ce que la conversation doit commencer et doit se poursuivre. So we can do better, but we need to talk about how. And the how is not that easy. It always sounds easy, but it's not that easy. The strength and depth of the Canadian genomics sector have never been more apparent. Success stories like that of our panelist Neil Aubuchon of Celera, from the West Coast that now has a foot in Montreal, I hear. Awesome. Now we're really national, aren't we? You're going to meet him just shortly. And I was discussing this morning with Dan Legault, I think was his name, Juniper Genomics. with an IVF diagnostic, really cool, actually, technology to improve IVF. Really amazing stuff going on in genomics in Canada, not just at the research, but at the industry level. And so we're beginning to provide, we're actually beginning now to provide some industry champions, such as Accelera, that we can be really proud of as a country. But we need more to connect the dots between the genomics innovations that we were talking about, those great ideas that we're developing, and the real world problems that need solutions. And the question really is, how do we do that? So the question that we're all here to explore today, how do we ignite growth in Canada's genomics sector? I will now invite Kate McCready onto the stage and the esteemed panelists to engage you in this amazing conversation. Have a great day. Thank you.
Bonjour tout le monde. Merci Elizabeth, et merci à Genome Canada. What a pleasure it is to be here. I'm going to be very honest, I'm very dazzled by the knowledge in this room and the passion and dedication you all bring to this sector. I had the privilege of being a very fundamental staff person way back when the press release of Genome Canada was published 25 years ago. And to see, I had nothing to do with it, by the way, it was a different department, but I have to say, to see who you are today and what you're accomplishing and what it means for Canada is truly inspiring to me. And in the work that I do on behalf of Biotech Canada and all of our members across the country, many of whom are here today as well, these are fascinating times. $175 million makes it even more fascinating. So again, congratulations to all of you on that one. Don't underestimate how difficult that was for Team Genome Canada and everybody else to pull together. You know, it's a fascinating time. We all read the news, we're all living it, we're all muddling through. But the fundamentals of the challenge that we're going to talk about today sadly have been around for quite a while. You're not going to hear new things, but you are going to hear an honest conversation from leaders in the sector who are working within Canada, but with an eye to their global aspirations around how the best of Canadian genomics has got the potential to drive economic value and ultimately solutions for our people and our planet. So I want to thank and welcome folks to take a seat. Neil Aubuchon from Accelera, Trevor Charles from the University of Waterloo, Tiago Hori of Atlantic Aqua Farms Limited, and Nancy Tout from the Global Institute for Food Security. Quite a spectrum of technology amongst these leaders. I'm really thrilled about this conversation today. I'm going to join you in a second, but as Elizabeth said, you know, these are interesting times. We do have our challenges. We understand what they are. They're not easily solvable, but given the dynamic of where Canada's at today, I'd like to think that some of the inspiration over the last week to 10 days has afforded Canadians a conversation around, in fact, how we can do better with each other and how that can make a difference ultimately for Canada, but also our planet and our world. So I think there's a lot of opportunity, if you can ever say there's an upside around a crisis. I think we're living it, and I think we can show it with the people in this room, to be perfectly honest. Funding, regulatory performance, imagination, knowledge transfer, talent development, all of those things are at hand in terms of when Canadian science, Canadian leadership moves into a business development commercialized cycle. These are not easy challenges. We know the government has come to terms to a certain degree with those challenges. We can't stop educating governments, regardless of color, stripe, timelines, around what those challenges are and what they mean to our sector and what they mean to the ecosystem at large. We have some bragging to do, everybody. It's a collective responsibility to get loud and proud about the opportunities that you're all striving for. And I think we're going to spend some time on that in this conversation. So, have they turned me on here? Hopefully. Can you all hear me? Yes? Okay, grand. So we had a bit of a pre-call a couple of weeks ago, and kind of looked at what the landscape looked like and what the commonalities are between the group here. So I'm going to first start by asking each of the panelists here today to introduce themselves and showcase the leadership that you're bringing and have been bringing to the sector and the ecosystem writ large here in Canada. I'm going to start at the end here, and we're going to work our way down.
All right, thanks. It's a pleasure to be here. It's a great announcement we had today. Really exciting for the whole community. I'm Neil Aubuchon. It's sort of an interesting symmetry for me to be here because I am a graduate of University of Toronto when I was completing my MBA. One of the reasons that caused me to go into the biopharmaceutical industry was because at the time there was a lot of excitement around the full genome being sequenced. And so because of that excitement, I thought, hey, this is probably an important industry to be part of. And here I am, 25 years later, here in this panel. So it's great to be here and to understand the success that's occurred over the last 25 years. I started with Eli Lilly in the U.S. After my MBA, and I've worked in Japan and Australia, so sort of 17 years at Lilly. And then I worked at Amgen in their corporate headquarters in California before moving back to Vancouver to work for AbCellera. Probably like a lot of Canadians, I wanted to always move back to Canada, but there wasn't a role really that I could take that was going to be appropriate for the experience that I had. So it's fantastic that I've been able to finally come back to Canada and land in that job at AbCellera. Just maybe one very briefly about AbCellera, because I think it's important for context. So we're based in Vancouver. We're a biotech company. We are going to be opening the first biologics manufacturing facility in Canada this year in Vancouver. But we are like fully Canadian based. So we are going to be filing our first 2 CTAs, clinical trial applications this year in Canada. We're going to do our phase 1 studies in Canada. We do have an office, as was mentioned, in Montreal. And those studies are going to be conducted mostly in Eastern Canada. So it's really important for us from a competitive perspective that we have a very globally competitive Canadian ecosystem, and I think that's the foundation for, I think, some of the discussion today. So, well,
Wonderful.
Yeah.
Great. Good morning. My name is Trevor Charles from University of Waterloo. And Waterloo, as many of you know, is well known for its entrepreneurship and cultivating entrepreneurship, especially through our inventor-owned IP policy. So I can tell you a little bit of story, won't take too long. But about 10 years ago, through a drought in funding that many of us academic scientists have, I got drawn into starting a company. And that company is Metagenome Biolife Science. It's still pretty small, but we use it sort of as an extension of our lab through offering DNA sequencing services, really to develop some additional spin-offs. So we have Healthy Hydroponics Inotech that does pathogen surveillance in hydroponic systems. The significance of that is half of the vegetables grown in Canada are grown in greenhouses, which are all hydroponic. We also have Earth Microbial, which develops and markets microbial products for turf, so golf courses is a big market there, and also for greenhouses. And I also want to provide a little bit of context, overall context. So not only is this 25 years for Genome Canada, but it's also 50 years for Microsoft, 49 for Apple, and I think that it's important to keep that in our heads. But also, it's 50 years since Asilomar, and Asilomar was really an important discussion that led to really the recombinant DNA revolution, which then led to synthetic biology and all of that sort of thing. And which I think is something that we need to keep in mind when we're talking about commercialization, because we have a regulatory structure all over the world which actively impedes innovation in genomics, in many aspects of genomics. We have to get our head around that if we're going to address the major challenges that we have.
So Thiago Hori, in a sense, it's interesting to be here. I'm your typical immigrant. I'm going to call it a success story, though. I don't like that. But with a twist that basically funded by Genome Canada. I moved to Canada in 2006 to do my PhD with the Genomics project in Halifax, Dalhousie NRC, and for the last 16 years I've been involved in Genome Canada projects without interruption, I think, and recently leading my 2 first projects. I've my area is the implementation of genomics into breeding technologies mostly. But now, even broadly thinking about how do you apply genomics to aquaculture of shellfish. And shellfish is an interesting thing for this discussion because I think there's some lack, there's a poor understanding of that industry and what we can and can't do that makes the translation of innovation into the industry a little bit more difficult.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Nancy Tout, and I've actually worked over 25 years in what I call the innovation supply chain, and that was really by design, and devoted always to agriculture and agri-food and our food systems. Although I was, my early days, and this will date me, doing my PhD was in CF research, and at the exact time that the gene was discovered, and of course I was working on antibody therapeutics, and it took I can't tell how long, in those DNA gels and all those sorts of things. And now the team that I led at the Global Institute for Food Security, the DNA is prepped by robots and loaded onto machines, and you sequence an entire wheat genome within hours. So that's the perspective that I have. So over 20 years I spent in private industry, and big private industry. I was part of a multinational organization, which meant that I represented Canada as head of research and development around the global table. So I wore the Canadian flag. I wrapped myself around that Canadian flag every time to make sure that we could get those investments here in Canada. But I was always curious, you know, as a budding scientist, you know, they sort of say, here's your career pathway, and you pick this lane. And I really wanted to intentionally get out of private industry and really sort of explore the public side of things. So I moved across the province and said, kids, you can't live in my basement anymore. I'm selling the family home. And moved to Alberta and did another great thing. I was part of a funding organization that was being started up in Alberta, which is partnership-driven and industry-driven, and that's part of core of who I am as a scientist as well, too. And spent a little bit of time there, and then was really attracted to one of my dream jobs, which is at the intersection of innovations, which is public and private partnerships when they come together. And that's what the Global Institute for Food Security was sort of started up to do. And when you bring in all of those different intersections of innovation, you can do great things in our food system. So the other thing that I would say about myself, to introduce myself, is I am two things along the innovation supply chain. I'm partnership-driven, and I'm impact-driven, and that's unapologetic. I know in our world sometimes commercialization becomes a bad word, and so I was really encouraged by the announcement this morning. Commercialization was front and center. Impact was front and center as well. And I do know that it takes all parts of the innovation supply chain across all the TRL levels, all the talent in the room today, government, public, and private, to sort of come together if we're going to really solve some of those tough challenges in agriculture. So look forward to the conversation.
Oh, that's great. What a gang. This is exciting. And I think what it does showcase to me as well is that if there had been one simple answer, we would have done that years ago. But the ever-evolving challenge and dynamic of discovery and research and competition is forcing us constantly to reevaluate, reassess, understand our place within the process. And so this is a bit of a fun question, but it's also a tough one. I'm going to start with you, Trevor, which is, what is keeping you up at night? We know that there are challenges out there, and as you look through the spectrum of what you've been accomplishing and what lies ahead, what does that feel like to you?
So what keeps me up at night? Well, I saw on the news yesterday a new report on bird flu.
Yeah.
Right? And I think that we don't pay enough attention to pandemic preparedness. You know, even though we learned so much during the last pandemic, and pandemics are not only diseases that affect us, but there are diseases that affect, you know, poultry, livestock, crop plants. They can be economically devastating, and starvation can ensue if we don't get our heads around it. So I think that we need to seriously think about how we can address those imminent threats to our civilization.
Yeah. Tiago.
I mean, I'm not gonna lie, what keeps me awake these days is the orange man. Because I'd be lying if I said otherwise. But climate change, and I don't think our industry specifically understands all the ramifications from climate change. So it's not just water warmings, which is terrible for us. So aquaculture is should be much more familiar for the crop people in the sense that we don't have mobility, or indoors we deal with the environment. And so climate change obviously is a nightmare. But there are these indirect effects that we're seeing now. I don't know, you're probably seeing this in the news, but we had 2 hurricanes in PEI in the last 5 years. You know, after having one was in like 2004, right? So, you know, the weather is getting riskier, it affects our farms, but then we're also having emergency of pathogens in Canada now, right? And that's one of the things that people are not thinking about. So one of the things that we're trying to work on is how to do surveillance in bodies of water with the eDNA, because it's becoming clear and clear that as the oceans are warming, the biology is moving up north, right? It's happening, we think it's happening with the lobster, but it's also happening with all these invasive species and pathogens, and those can really destroy an industry. And there have been examples of it in aquaculture. So I think we need to think about climate change as more, and I'm not the first to say that, but we have to keep thinking about climate change as more than temperature.
Yeah. Great. Well, I'm going to 3 short things, but one of them, of course, because I spent most of my career in regulatory affairs, I do want to say that regulations and advocating for science-based, predictable, and globally harmonized things are the things that kept me awake at night. And we continually have to be vigilant around that. However, I do want to give a huge shout out, because I have been sleeping a lot lately, because Canada is world leading in its gene editing guidelines. So if there are regulators in the room, I can't thank you enough. It does sort of pave the way for a navigation tool for companies, because it takes 10 years. And, you know, 280, I think, and Lauren, I'm looking at you, the new number on how much it takes, you know, a single, you know, whether that's a crop protection product in agriculture or a seed variety to bring to marketplace. So it does bring that consistency. So I say great news, and Canada does need to be world leading in its regulations. And it's great that we've not looked to Europe, that did say no to science, and that cost them, I think it was 3 trillion euros. It was the economic loss that I saw in saying no to science. So regulations, but what I do still keep awake at night are innovation silos. And now, having worked in 3 provinces, I do see that, unfortunately, right across Canada. We are Team Canada. Innovation is really a team sport. And when we are competing amongst ourselves in this room here and across the country as innovators, it means we need to be thinking about competing with the rest of the world, because that is our competitive advantage. So the third thing I would say is, and some people would challenge me on this, and they would say, it's great that we have so many funding programs, but I'm going to put that as a challenge. They are complex. After I left private industry and tried to navigate around that, they are complex. We have a mosaic. They're not inclusive. So when I think of DEI, I think of, you know, are all of the innovators brought into this circle of, you know, sort of funding programs, and are all the strengths all kind of brought together, you know, from that regard. So, and I would say sometimes they're not. Sometimes they're not business friendly if we're looking to try to, you know, sort of promote that commercialization aspect as well too. So, yes, I would say the funding programs is the other. If we were to take a more, you know, I'm always a solution-oriented person, so we have to think about innovation along, again, the entire supply chain, which I often call it. And if we had a balanced portfolio, so I'm very interested in where the $175 million is going to go. We think about our own retirement. I'm thinking about that more and more lately. My retirement profile is, you know, spread out across that. And so I think similarly, from an innovation programming perspective, we absolutely have to be thinking about how we have that balanced portfolio that's going along all the technology readiness levels, and balanced, and brings in all the great experts in government, academia, and private industry, both small, medium, and large.
That's particularly relevant as we see over the last few days some of the interprovincial conversations finally happening around something as fundamental as internal trade. Why it's taken the South to give us that lesson is, we'll just leave that alone. But the fact that we actually now have a conversation started in this country that is very motivated and timely around how we break down some of these interprovincial barriers, if you will. And I'd like to think that, in fact, this is a community that could showcase that to the next level as well. So you can deal with it when you're fighting about wine in what province, but in fact, it goes much more broadly than that. And I'd like to think that we have a role as an ecosystem, as a sector, to really drive some of those conversations going forward. So putting on my political advocacy hat, don't lose that one, run with it. Let's figure out how we do that, Rob and team.
Sure, I'll comment. The great thing about going last is I could say, oh, I agree with my brilliant colleagues. But I'll try and put a slightly different spin. But I do agree, in particular, the last two comments around the sort of Team Canada approach. It's funny, and not to put the political hat on. Last night at the reception, I was talking to someone. I will not mention the person's name, but they said that they do take wine across provincial borders, and they sort of said it in hushed tones. And it is actually quite ridiculous when you think about that. And that if we don't take a Team Canada approach, and that's just kind of a microcosm of the broader issues that I think that Nancy was talking about. What I would say is like the challenge, what keeps me up at night is the opportunity is the challenge. It's sort of two sides of the same coin. We have fantastic science that exists in Canada. We have great talent. And it's just a matter of like, are we able to cut across our silos and harness that, the power of the talent and that we have here and the science that we have here to produce something world-class. And I do feel, and maybe again it's building on Nancy's comments, is that we do tend to kind of get in our own way too frequently, and sometimes we think too small. I can tell you from an Obselera perspective, and I'll try and be a bit provocative because again, it's in our interest to be, to solve these problems. I asked my team to look at, genomics and said, hey, what should we do in that space? And I didn't give them any guidelines at all. And they just sort of went away, and they're smart people, and they came back and said, we have a solution. The solution is we should partner with the UK. And it was interesting for me because that's what they kind of came back independently. And it's because they're easy to partner with. They have access to sequencing data for hundreds of thousands of patients. And I went on to look at the UK Biobank, and they have investments from AWS that was, that's not government funding. That was AWS just gave them that money. They have a collaboration with Geisinger Health, which is a US healthcare firm that has medical records that are fully sequenced of all these patients that have given informed consent. So I do think it's important that we need to focus on a Team Canada approach, but we also can't just be too insular either.
That's right.
Like we have to look at sort of the broader world, and there are other groups like, and I don't know the specifics, but Geisinger Health or AWS or these type of groups that have shown an interest in this, and how do we collaborate with them? And I can tell you that if we take a siloed approach, we will never be successful because those groups, it's a global meritocracy, and having worked at global headquarters of companies, you say, where should we put our capital? We want to invest with partners who we think are going to be winners. And if you're looking at someone and say, well, they're siloed, I'm not sure, then you're like, well, then we're not going to invest. If there's a group that says, we have a vision, we have ambition, we think we can do this, they're coming together, then that is a group that you want to partner with. And so we need to do that better, and that's the thing that keeps me up at night. But last thing I'd say is, I think we can do it. Just to be clear, I'm an optimist, but we do have to get out of our own way in order for that to happen.
Yeah, I mean, in our sector, we've been seized recently with conversations around clinical trials and how, with all due respect to Canada being 40, 41 million people, the reality is we're relatively small. And when it comes to the data race, if we are still struggling in this day and age to find connectivity around the most fundamental data opportunities for sharing and learning, we're going to lose. There's no two ways about it. I know there's terrific initiatives that have been started to try and coalesce the national footprint along these lines. Health Canada's got an ambition along those lines as well. But wow, do we have work to do. It's a perfect example of getting in our own way, but also seeing an opportunity to smarten up too, right? I mean, Tiago, I want to kind of switch a little bit to you because you mentioned obviously the unique science that it relates to where you're living, where you're working, the company you've created. There's a huge value dynamic in a place like PEI when a team of people that you framed come together and work on projects like this. I know that, in fact, life sciences and biotech has changed the GDP in PEI. We do a lot of work with the PEI Bio Alliance. They're just going gangbusters down there. And so, Tiago, I kind of wanted to throw a little bit at you in terms of, leveraging the work you do as an example of that within a local market, but also in a national market, because PEI's growth has actually helped Canada ultimately set some goals and targets.
Yeah, so I think PI Bio Alliance is a good example, right? I think when it comes to genomic science, we had to get more comfortable with what I call funding the boring, right? We can't just be funding the exciting. Because the reality is genomics grew and had huge impact in well-established sectors that had that capacity to pick up an idea and integrate that into their, into their operations. Pharma, large ag, all these industries. By the time genomics really matured, they were big businesses. Yeah. With a lot of money, right? That is not the case for anybody in aquaculture other than one salmon company in Norway. And so I always say that, people think that innovation is just excitement, but it's not. There's a part that is boring, which is reproducibility, application, looking at your ROI and make sure that it makes sense. Those things are boring. They're not discoveries. It's doing again and again and again and again, and we don't fund that while other countries do, direct to the industry. I think that that's one of the basic limitations, because I come out of every project, and we have the advantage of being backed by an owner that is interested in that, but it's not the case for most companies in this space. And as genomics progress and starts to infiltrate other even smaller industries, it's going to become worse, right? Because there's no high return. Like, one thing is to talk about a startup in pharma where you discover something and there's huge potential. There's no huge potential for tomorrow profit, right? But I'll give you an example. I still believe that mussels are the best solution to the protein requirements of the world, right? It's a low footprint, no carbon, no input, carbon, whoever you say, slightly carbon positive, carbon negative, or what's called neutral. It's healthy, right? But this industry doesn't have the money to become that. It doesn't have the resources, it doesn't have the time, right? So we have to start thinking about how do we help these sectors to take these ideas and become, because if you're gonna give an example of us, like if we're gonna just do that through IRAP, which is what we do mostly in the years, and ACOA, it's just, we're not gonna be able to implement genomic selection, right? Or things like that we're talking about big investments and big OPEX and big budgets. So, I mean, I know that it's exciting and I am a scientist, but like when I move to industry, I come to learn the value of boring. And I think we need to recognize that there's value in boring research.
But you're not boring.
Yeah.
You're not boring. But Nancy, I think there's a nice dovetail there between Tiago's comments and your expertise in terms of looking at the dynamic food security. I mean, we're hearing about, the price of eggs and all the other machinations. But global food security has been on our landscape of issues for quite a while. And we're at a point now where genomics has started to really emerge as a solution base. It's already within the global marketplace to a large degree. What are you seeing and what are you thinking might be coming next in terms of some of the opportunities and challenges on that front?
Well, thanks, Kate, and you're right. I think food became part of the conversation long before the word tariff sort of all of a sudden became part of our daily vocabulary, because obviously we've had conflict around the world, right? When you think about Ukraine and Russia. So you've got conflict, you've got, the trade wars, you've got extreme weather events, you've got, climate change and the moisture, availability. So there's all sorts of things that are challenging from a food security perspective, and that's only sort of increasing in our world today. And so luckily we have the world of genomics, which I personally feel is one of the strongest ways out of Canada's what I call sometimes productivity gap, which has been widening since 2011. And so I look at that $30 billion productivity gap as an opportunity for genomics and for all of us in this room here. I think where we need to go, because again, I agree, Andre, you said it last night, we're just scratched the surface. Rob, you said it, we're just getting started. We've, in the agriculture industry, we've generated all this vast amount of genomic data and information, and what we're not doing, with the exception of, shout out to dairy industry, celebrate them in a big, big way, who are using it to their advantage. But I would say on the plant side of things, there's a really opportunity to harness the genomic information that we've generated. And again, right now they're in little silos in everybody's own databases. But if you think about the power of, again, genomic selection to really accelerate outputs, because we're dealing with tough pest problems now. So when we think about biotic stresses that the farmers have, which is things like, diseases and insects that destroy their crops, leading to huge economic losses for Canada. And then you've got the abiotic stresses. So those are all very complex things to sort of tackle. And, you talk about your industry, Tito, as having, just this small amount of sort of information. And so how do you, take advantage and maximize, and you can't do that as a small, which means you got to bring them all together. And that's what we need to do in the plant industry as well, too. If you harness the power of that genomic data, break down those barriers and silos from how do we share the data and all those kinds of things, yes, absolutely. But when you can use the power of genomic data, you layer on artificial intelligence, you layer on quantitative geneticists, you layer on automation, all the bioinformatics, the computational power, wow, like great things that can happen. We can find the solution to fusarium head blight and sclerotinia and canola and all those kinds of great things. And so we're right on the cusp of, and I agree with you, Neil, we've got sort of all these components and all the right ingredients. We're not sort of stringing them all together and making them all, sort of work together. And that's really where I think Genome Canada can really, play a huge, huge role in coordinating and bringing that real effort together, right from start to kind of finish too, because I see sometimes too, we should and we ought to be setting up these innovation hubs across Canada, not duplicating them at every university or every government lab. Let's figure out, where those regional centers of excellence are going to be and, invest in that so we can sort of do that great work and bring them all together in that integrated framework and mindset of and expertise that we sort of, need to be able to do that. So, yeah.
Make money smarter.
Absolutely. And like I said, we've got the great ingredients. We've got all the right ingredients. I'm not sure that the recipe for the greatest cake is coming out. I think there's bits and pieces and we need to celebrate that. But this is about launching into the next, 25, 50 years that the introduction sort of talked about this morning, because if we don't do it, someone else is going to do that. And Canada's really got all the talent here, and we can do it.
Well, and I think that feeds a little bit, Neil, into what I was thinking about in terms of your contribution to the conversation, which is you've had all these global roles. You've come back to Canada, so welcome home. And taking a look at really what you're seeing in the landscape in terms of what are the real opportunities for Canada to get this right, in terms of, okay, if we can weave a fabric together a little bit more effectively than we have before. You're sitting on the cusp of an unbelievable success with Abcelera. It's inspiring to a lot of folks. What is the next wave of this looking like from your perspective as you kind of sit in Vancouver, snowy Vancouver, he said, and in terms of the work you're doing both in Montreal but across the country?
Yeah, so a couple comments just to build off of Nancy's comments, and having spent time in the U.S., sometimes I find coming back to Canada, we sort of say, oh, the U.S., this, that, and the other. But of course, there are regions in the U.S. too, right? And a lot of the biotech sector is based in Boston and San Francisco. So I worked at Eli Lilly for many years. It's in Indianapolis. And what was the number one concern they had there? That there was no biotech ecosystem in Indiana and the Midwest, et cetera. So coming back to Canada, these are things that you do hear in other parts of the world and other regions in the U.S. So it's not a uncommon issue that people are thinking about. In terms of where the next opportunities are, I think the issue of target identification, target validation, because of course for us, you've got to start a program to try and develop a new medicine. But of course, you say that quite easily, but it's like, well, what do you work on? And the probabilities of success are very, very low in our industry, even if you do everything right. So if you can increase that probability, that is a huge advantage. So that's one area. The other area, of course, is going to be the next, the focus of the next panel, and that is precision medicine. So for payers, the government of Canada, but private health insurers, whoever it is around the world, the most expensive medicine you can have is the medicine that doesn't work. And so, there's a lot of medicines that are very good, but they don't work for all people. So if you can increase the probability of it working in a patient, then the healthcare system can be more efficient. One of the things that, the biotech and biopharmaceutical industry talks about is, getting appropriately rewarded for innovation. And I think that's a fair debate to have, but it's incumbent on us to make sure that it's working in a higher proportion of patients so that we're not kind of wasting, money of the healthcare system. So that's the other area I think that genomics can play a big role in the industry.
Trevor, you're not bored either, right? I mean, there you sit at one of Canada's preeminent universities. You see how the world has come to Canada to learn, to share, to collaborate. The work that you're doing both from a corporate perspective, but also in terms of your role as an academic leader, looking at how we can capitalize on the strength of that talent, that energy, that curiosity, and what do we need to do better over the next number of years to really be able to bring that wealth of talent into the system and drive our commercial success?
So I think that we all recognize that we're not very inclusive. And so I'd like to just spend a little bit of time talking about how we can harness all the talent that is not being involved in genomics or really any other type of science. So I'm a real big fan of entrepreneurship in engaging underrepresented communities. We recently had a hiring exercise at University of Waterloo for Black and Indigenous scholars. And I was on many of the hiring panels for that, for the Black competitions. And one of the things that we saw is that most of the applicants did not go through their high school in Canada, right? So we really exclude within our school system members of the Black communities in particular. And we need to figure out how to fix that. And any type of DEI or EDI exercise that we do at the level of a research grant application is largely going to be ineffective because it happens way, way before that. And so I just wanted to point to some things that are being done. So Larry Goodridge, who's in the room here, president of the Canadian Black Scientists Network, has been heavily involved in really mentoring and guiding Black students in science fair activities. And they've gone on to do amazingly well, winning Canada-wide science fairs. So the talent is there, and we just have to figure out how to harness it. Also, my experience in entrepreneurship a few years ago with federal funding, we started the Liftoff Black Entrepreneurship Program in Kitchener-Waterloo area, and we've had about 140 entrepreneurs who've come in. We haven't given them funding, but we've given them coaching and training and sector agnostic, so it's not really directly related to genomics or any type of science, but you can see how these founders have thrived, where they really were not included, they were not part of the ecosystem beforehand, and it doesn't really take that much to have a real impact. And so there are things that we can do. I just think that we're going about it maybe not the most efficient or effective way.
How would you fix it?
How would I fix it? I think really we need to focus on what goes on in the schools, right? There's outreach that we can all do in the schools. My son is a new high school teacher in Winnipeg, and I'm hoping that he's going to have an impact. Also, we have to look at ways that we can, as I said, harness entrepreneurship in the universities. Introduce some of the graduate students and undergraduate students to some of the opportunities that there are to build a business, forge your own pathway that can have huge impacts. Yeah.
Huge challenges, right? So I'm going to make each of you now the minister responsible for the next generation of genomic learning and exploration in Canada. I'm going to start with you. You win. Haha. And I wanted to say, what is the number one thing that you believe the federal ministry or federal government should be doing to really move forward on the opportunity at hand within this sector? I'm going to start with you, Nancy.
Amazing. I love that you don't stick to your script. It's
Well,
not a question that you sent.
I sort of am.
I love it.
Nicholas can have
innovative.
words with me afterwards.
But it's a fun one. It's a fun one if I was sort of the minister in charge. Again, I think I would, look across. For those that know me, I'm partnership-driven collaboration. I believe all the best ideas will come from everybody working together. And so, finding ways to sort of, stitch up the whole community, to think bold and aspirational. Again, I agree with the comments that sometimes we're just satisfied, we've got, that little project resulted in a genetic gain of 0.8% for wheat. Well, we could actually 3 times this if we actually use the power of all the information. So to be able to stitch together, and I think we do need to invest in world-leading, what I will call these innovation, and call them genomic centers of excellence or hubs. And because the technology is out of date almost as soon as you purchase the equipment. So as an example, a piece of equipment at the Global Institute for Food Security, right? So if you scatter those across the country and don't fill all of those machines, all the consumables cost, way more than they need to be, and they're not cost competitive. People now actually in Canada are sending their samples to China or to the US. And so we have to have cost competitive centers of excellence invested in here in Canada, and we need to constantly be investing in both the, what I will call the human capital and the equipment capital, because I agree in the people side of things too. It took me a year to recruit a quantitative geneticist, very difficult recruitment, and able to recruit from someone from around the world. But those are the sorts of things that we need to sort of understand where we're going to go to, as Wayne Gretzky always says, where we're going to need to be in 10 years. And let's start to get those trainees and mentorships in place to be able to fill those labs with really trained experts. So.
Minister Tiago.
Yeah, two quick comments, I think. Just to go on sort of a crusade, but I think one thing that we need to do is that we need to have 2 very uncomfortable conversations. And one is how about we train and treat graduate students. So we don't train graduate students to function well in the industry, right? I think that nobody's going to disagree. And we need to start doing that. Again, it's boring. We need people that know how to do boring research, right? It's not enough. Everybody talks about entrepreneurship, and I love it. But somebody has to do the boring work, right? That doesn't generate $10 million next week. Yeah. And a second uncomfortable conversation I think we need to have in Canada is are we happy with our funding ecosystem and the way it works and the criteria it uses and the impact it has in research? And I'll give you one example. Now, most of the funding areas we are a partnership between industry. They have to have an industry partner, which is great, but it also created this movement within universities of people trying to mask their research as applied to get funding from these, because NSERC, for example, has very little money, right? And I'm not against basic research, but if we're doing the basic research is one thing, let's fund basic research is important, let's give NSERC and SERC more money. But when you talk about applied, let's fund stuff that it's going to be translated in the next 5 years, right? And we're not doing that. But I really think also we have to take care of our grad students.
Nicely done. Minister Trevor.
So I think we can't be afraid to fund startups directly. That seems to be a no-go in Canada for some reason. It's not in the US. A big advantage in the US there with SBIR grants and that sort of thing. And myself as an academic, I really have no interest in partnering with industry, because first there's a conflict of interest because I am in industry, right? And there's so many more academics every day who are starting their own companies. And does industry really want to partner with academics to do the research? Why are they not developing the ability to do the research themselves, right? I think that really we should be building that capability within Canadian companies.
Okay.
Okay. I think I'll sort of keep it at the strategic level. I would say that if I was the minister, I would be saying in 10 years, I want to see, what it's going to take for Canada to have a world-class genomics capability from an international perspective. And I wouldn't care if, Alberta got more than Quebec or more than Ontario. I wouldn't care about the regional perspective, because I think if you solve for that problem, you're not solving for the Team Canada approach. And so that doesn't mean, just by the way, that the different regions don't have an important role to play. I think they absolutely do. But it's, again, what problem are you trying to solve? Are you trying to solve for equalization, or are you trying to solve for a Team Canada approach? And I can tell you that if you try and solve for the former approach, you'll never be successful on a global stage. We're too small of a country. We have to unite, get out of our own way, and develop the capabilities to be competitive on the global stage. And that means doing more things collectively together, removing those not being siloed at all. And it also means, stepping outside of Canada and collaborating with international partners more aggressively and being confident as we do that. So I think that's more conceptual than sort of maybe specific policy, but that would be kind of what I would be expecting to achieve.
A good mandate letter for a minister, that's for sure.
Yeah.
One of the things that we've been tracking at Biotech Canada has been the investment dynamic into the sector through the life science lens specifically since 2021 into the end of 2023, and it was about $23 billion. So, we're talking about huge value. That's a massive footprint that has been attracted into this country, put operating dollars in. Now, some of the sources of those dollars are M&A, so we lose some of those technologies to international partnerships. I don't think that's ever going to go away, but how are we doing a better job ultimately in competing for dollars? The rest of the world is in this race too, right? We're not sitting here alone with all these fabulous ideas. And the challenge is a great one. And given the global dynamic that we've been living with since November 20th, we need to really sharpen up as a country. Our maple leaf matters, so do our provincial flags, but internationally, we've got to come together in a pan-Canadian way, to your point earlier. We've got about 4 minutes left, so I'm going to give each of you a minute to say, if you wanted people here in the room to understand one thing about the ambition that you drive within your work, what is it?
Okay, so I think ambition is really important. So we are trying to become the next kind of Regeneron. Regeneron's about a $100 billion company. We would like to be that and be headquartered in Canada. And that's very different than having an ambition of getting to $2 billion and then selling the company. So we're not trying to do that. We're trying to do the former. But it's the same, I would say the same thing to the folks in the room of what is our ambition? If we don't have the ambition, it's never going to happen. Just my last comment is, people probably have read the Malcolm Gladwell book, The Tipping Point, and they talk about if you're a hockey player, in whatever, the Northwest Territories, and you're good enough, you're going to get found in Canada, because Canada in hockey is a meritocracy, right, if you're a good enough player. The same thing is true with science. And having worked at the headquarters of these multinational firms, we would look at things in Africa and Europe, all over the world. So if it pops up as being good, someone is going to be interested. We have to have the ambition to go for the gold, I guess. Yeah.
So I'll just be brief. So I always think of things as, how can we solve global challenges from a circular bioeconomy perspective? And genomics is a really important part of that. And I always think that biology is better than chemistry.
And then I'll go back to the solution on the basis, right? And I think when you train people to work in the industry at the formation level, but I think I would encourage every research that is working on applied science to always ask themselves the question, is this feasible in the industry, or is going to be applied, right? I don't think we ask that question enough when we're in the lab or thinking solutions of writing grants. That should be, it's not only it has potential, it is actually feasible, right? And I don't think we ask that question hard enough. When there's always a bid on the grant proposal, but we're not asking that question hard enough to guarantee a maximization of the dollars that go into research in terms of post-impact into the industry. So I think that's something.
Nice.
I would simply, it's an invitation almost to, you know, to come to the table, to think really, really bold, to think about this next horizon for genomics, to be quite ambitious, and for Canada to be world leaders. And I think to be able to do that, we do have to do it differently. We've been very successful up to today, and I don't think we can be successful with that same strategy. So I agree, what is that strategy 10, 25 years out? How do we sort of come together and really drive this home? And I would say from an agriculture perspective and food security perspective, we can tackle things like sustainability, economic, environmental, and social, along with all the challenges that I talked about from that. So it's not an either or. Genomics allows us to solve all of the problems together, because of course you can create a genomic selection index then that goes across the chain. So what a beautiful opportunity for Canada to be able to seize the $30 billion gap that we have. And I'm really confident that this Team Canada that's in the room today and across the country is really going to do that. So I look forward to celebrating at the next summit on how we did that and how we came together.
25 years goes like that, right?
It does.
At the end of the day. Look, I want to thank all of you, one, for the personal learning and sharing today for me. It was a real privilege to join you here today. I want to thank Genome Canada again for this opportunity and bringing everybody together. And I think, again, for everybody who doesn't live and breathe the Ottawa dynamic, please understand that getting $175 million from a federal government that is seized with all kinds of stresses is no mean feat. So again, kudos to Team Genome Canada, and thank you all.